much for joining us today for this edition of the Roundtable Discussions. Today we're going to be talking about the connection between reading and writing. Let me introduce you to the people that we have at our table. To my left here is Samantha Love, who is a graduate student here at Troy and also teaches in the ESL department. To my immediate left is Mike Orlovsky, who teaches creative writing in the English department on this Troy campus. I'm going to skip you, I'll come back to you. On my far right is Dr. Stephen Cooper, chair of the English department, also teaches Southern writing and American literature in the English department. And then to my immediate right is Rod Davis. Sorry. Rod Davis, an accomplished author, I will say. I've read your books and I like them. Yay. So currently at Texas A&M, thank you, and visiting with us today. Let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about what reading actually is. Our QEP is promoting engaged reading among our students. What is exactly engaged reading? Sam, what do you think?
I feel like engaged reading means being able to read something either assigned in class or for the fun of it and applying it to your life, not just reading it to say, yeah, sure, I've read it, you know. It's being able to learn from it, enjoy it, and have the desire to read.
Yeah, that's good. What about you, Mike? How do you see engaged reading?
Well, a lot of times when I assign a work to my students, they groan and moan. And for example, right now we've just started Dante's Inferno, which is one of the tougher works of literature, and I warned them that it is. And it's amazing, and I think all of the teachers here have experienced this. When I read it, you know, Mr. O, I didn't know what it was about, but after you talked about it, right. It's making a lot of sense. And so I think that there needs to be kind of like a student-mentor relationship if we want to get students engaged beyond, you know, stories or books or plays that are like purely adventure stories, yeah, right. You know, and you know, and I don't care what kids read, you know, as long as they're reading, and then if they'll meet me halfway, I think teachers can influence the engagement of a student's reading.
I think so too. Steve, what about in your classes? What would you consider engaged reading?
I think it's when students get to a point where they're reading beyond just the plot. They start to realize that there's more going on than you know, just the plot, just the story. I just like it or I don't. I always tell my students, my syllabus, I'll say, well, I know there's going to be something in here you're going to hate. I'm hoping there's something in here you'll love. But the point is, even if you hate it, you need to try to at least give the author to figure out what they're doing and maybe appreciate why other people might like it. Yeah. I'm currently doing Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. And speaking of a book that
it's one of my favorites.
That gives students some problems. But you know, one way of engaging them too is showing that those works are dealing with issues. Okay, some of the specifics are different, but there are issues that still affect them, issues that they can, you know, how they can still relate to those issues.
Yeah.
You know, my daughter is in that class, and when
really?
When Anna, hey Anna, when Anna started As I Lay Dying, she was kind of at loose ends. But the more she got into it, you know, really got into it, and then when she finally finished, she says, "I love this book." Now that's the neat thing. I think that's where I think teachers come in. Take my word for it. You know, this is a good book, and if you persevere, kind of like Odysseus, you'll be able to accomplish a goal.
And maybe an engaged reader is also one who'd be willing to go back and reread some. Because with Faulkner, I always tell them the first time through a Faulkner book, you're just spending a lot of time figuring out what is going on and who is who. If you can go back and reread it, suddenly all these things start jumping out at you. Oh, that connects with this connects with that.
is it important, do you think it's necessary for someone who is in the university to be an engaged reader? Is that a necessity for getting a good education, or is it just a plus?
Well, if you know, I'll start the ball rolling here. At the beginning of my literature classes, I try to impress upon the kids, well, let's try to be engaged reader, and that's the first thing they need to have when they read. It's something that'll force them maybe to slow down, ponder a line that they can savor a little bit later, even a line that they don't understand. I don't know what it is psychologically, but when we engage with the book returns the investment, you know. And trying to persuade students that's going to happen is a big part of I think a teacher's job.
I think so too. Earlier you called it energetic reading. I like that because I think that's what engaged reading is, when you're actually putting some energy into what you're reading. How does that play into your being a writer?
I was thinking of that when the term came up. I hadn't heard of engaged reading, so that's why I did that. But it's not just reading on a treadmill. It's but I think what the term, thinking about when I also taught freshman and sophomore rhetoric, we called it, the students who you would assign a text, and some would like it and were engaged with it, and it just occurred to me, the non-engaged are the ones that I noticed the most, because you couldn't get through a book that maybe had some meaning to me, or could have been, when I taught travel narratives, The Snow Leopard, Peter Matheson, I thought had a lot of meaning in it, as well as a pretty good story. Some people responded to the religious conversation going on, the spiritual conversation, the question of meaning in your life, and some just didn't want to read it. They were not engaged, so I could tell the difference when I think of it in that term. For myself, since I self-select the books I want to read, almost all the books I read I find myself engaged with, because but I appreciate the point. There's something beyond the plot, and that's maybe what gets you. On the plane here, I was reading a book by Eric Prince, who founded Blackwater, the massive security firm, and I don't agree with much of maybe some stuff were in it, but I was interested, how did that work? And all the writing was not all that great. I became engaged with the subject, and I could skip over the parts I didn't want to, but I found myself, I thought I wouldn't finish that book. After about a third of it, I was like, I'm never going to finish this book. But I kept going back to it, and found that I got something out of it in the end. So I remember, and I saw part of the world I didn't particularly understand that well. Fiction, some books appeal to me much more, and I remember them long after. And I'll go back and read them again, like The Moviegoer. I probably read that 3 or 4 times now, because I like it. There's, I could probably think of some other ones like that too, but I'll usually find something in there that appeals to me, and maybe I wouldn't choose it in the first place. We talked in an earlier class about going way back when people read Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha, Steppenwolf, all that. At the same time, I was reading Vonnegut, who I know is out of favor with some people, but I like him. And I carried around a Cat's Cradle in my pocket when I was overseas, and Slaughterhouse-Five still has a lot of appeal to me. Some books that earlier influenced me, Robert Stone's Dog Soldiers and Hall of Mirrors, I really responded to a lot of stuff. Now I can hardly read Hall of Mirrors, but Dog Soldiers still, because it's all in the vernacular of the time that dates itself a little bit, even though the plot, what it's about, still holds meaning to me. So I feel like it's one of those things, it's how much you put into it, maybe how much you get out of it. But when you think of a student experience, I think anybody that's taught can tell in a class when people are tuned in or they just have to read it. I don't know how you conquer that. I have seen people change their minds altogether. When I taught at UT, I taught popular culture there for a while, and we did read different kinds of readings. And One of them we did was Dispatches, Michael Hurwitz, a discussion of the Vietnam War, journalistic account. The people, and that was in the 80s, I guess, didn't understand a lot of the terminology in there, the references, which I just took for granted. And so we had to work through that. But they stuck with it and ended up really, most of the class really liked the book. In fact, one guy in there I'll never forget, he was a petroleum engineering major. As a result of reading that book, and maybe another one in the class, he changed his major to journalism and went out and changed his whole life. So that impact is an engaged reader, right?
Right,
So
exactly.
it's wonderful what they can do, but when they don't catch, you're like, why can't I?
One of my most despairing moments in the classroom was a student asking me, why do you have us reading this stuff? And I gave him the spiel. Well, it'll make you it'll broaden your horizons and make you a better person. And he stopped me and said, Mr. O, practicing my golf game during this hour would do more for me than reading Shakespeare. And you know, that hits you like a bus, and you wonder, how do you respond to that mentality? In my head, I'm saying, well, yeah, you know, yeah, go play golf. You know. But you know, it is a two-way street. One of the things that turned me on about journalism was a book that a teacher assigned by Tom Wolfe, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Remember back in the mid 70s? And I was just fascinated by what Wolfe would do with language. And it's like, gee, I didn't know you could do that with a word, spread it across, you know, the whole page. Now, I don't know, I don't think I was much different of an undergraduate than, you know, our undergraduates. I don't know what that key is that unlocks some minds and doesn't others.
No, I think one issue all of us around the table were probably engaged readers long before we were English majors or whatever.
True.
You know, I was a reader from the time I was in elementary school. And so I've always thought central to education is being an engaged reader. I may be wrong. I still feel that. I mean, it's hard for me to think of a college, university educated person who's not to some degree a reader. But there are some.
Well, you know, in my experience, you know, Dad was in the Army and Mom was a stay-at-home mom, but Dad always had books around the house, even if they were the Reader's Digest condensed versions. Right. And from the time I was young, I saw Dad, you know, read books, and it made that stuck, that impression. This is something that Dad thinks is worthwhile, and I'm going to give it a try, too.
It was my mother, because she said to me a few years ago, I don't know how you became an English major, and I said, it was your fault, Mom, because she read to me, you know, before I went to school. She always has been a reader. She's still a reader. You know, I said, it's your fault. I don't know why you say it's a surprise to you.
And maybe all of us have read. Did you read when you were young too? Enjoy reading?
I did. I read a lot, and I also wrote a lot, and I think that's kind of how it has affected the track that I pursued in my undergraduate. I took a lot of literature courses, some with, you know, Dr. Cooper, but I also took a lot of creative writing courses.
Yes.
So one thing that I've noticed was that all of my courses, while they were separate, I might have taken American literature, I might have taken British literature, they all connect in so many ways. And so one of my most favorite aspects of, you know, just being an English major was being able to say, wow, Faulkner used something that I saw in Melville, and I saw that, and you know, I've seen this in so many other books, and then being able to see that and maybe even pursue those similar connections in my own writing, that's helped me so much.
That's
that
what a liberal arts education does
That's
to
what
you.
it's for.
What came first, I'm curious, the writing or the reading for you?
I was so young. I remember having notebooks, and I would write something and I'd tear it out saying, that's not good, that's not good. And so now I've got boxes of half torn out notebooks, you know, beside children's books. So probably reading. My mom read to me a lot whenever I was a child. So.
And I have a theory that that when children are read to, when they're small, they absorb that the cadence, the syntax of the written language, which is different from our spoken language, and that writing comes more naturally to students or to children who are read to. Do you think there is a connection? That's my theory. Do you think there's a
Rod,
connection
well,
between reading and writing?
I was just thinking, the first book I can remember, adult book reading, I was in the 6th, Treasure Island, I think. There was one before that, but, so I'm like, why did I want to read that? And then there was a competitive phase when I was in the 7th or 8th grade of all things with this kid that read all these books. And like, I'm going to read that book. And, but before that, why did that lead up to the point where I wanted to start reading it? Somewhere, could have been being read to, could have been 2nd, 3rd, 4th grades. Something happened to get me interested in that. When I look at the situation today, I used to ask students, what did you read? What books have you read before you got here? Or what did you read last year? What did you read? Some, none. Magazines maybe, or books that were not really, didn't mean much. No challenging works that I hardly ever heard. You're just so excited if somebody read a book. And I think the problem in translating that into writing is reading, I think, is directly affected to the quality of your writing. It has to be. I mean, that's how you learn how words work together. So if people are not reading now, early in the system, by the time they get out of the elementary school, they're already kind of behind the curve. And so it doesn't get a lot better through high school that I've noticed. The ones that stand out, they'll go against the grain, that actually are reading. What we try is, why are they engaging with their reading, and what is the difference? It's somewhere back there, so that the time they get here, if they're not interested in it, it's hard to get them interested in it now, or they might not have the skills. They won't relate to it. They see it as, I'd rather go play golf or whatever else they think is more important.
Rod, who was the storyteller in your family?
My grandmother, I remember, was a storyteller. Yeah.
I'm thinking in every writer's life, there has to be a storyteller there. So in my family, it was my mom.
Yeah.
She, frequently she would tell us the same story over and over again. But I'm thinking there's that anchor there, just the fascination with narrative.
Maybe that's the right word. If there's something that fascinates you, you're going to want to do more of it. And if there's a mystery, or you like it, it makes you happy, or however that is interpreted, and so if you read, it might be. I remember reading, was it Nordhoff and Hall, Mutiny on the Bounty, things like that. There were adventures, and so that was fun to me as a little boy to read. But out of that, somewhere I must have liked the way language worked. And then you distinguish other as you get bigger. But if you're not doing that at some early age, I really wonder if you can catch up. So that's your problem. How do you catch them up now? What do you do you turn it over to 50 Shades of Grey? I mean, in a way of like, if they read anything, I'm glad. But it doesn't teach you much critical thinking to do that.
And engaged reading is an exercise in critical thinking. It's analysis, it's making connections, and I think all of those activities, all of those thinking skills, maybe they develop over time from childhood for some people, but then, I think that is our challenge. Can we teach that to students?
Here's a test for the people at the round table. Have you ever stopped reading a book? Or have you persevered till its very end? I'll start. In my case, there have been books I finished and threw across the room, but very, very few that I stopped in the middle of and said, this is just worthless.
Yeah.
I have the same problem. There's very few that I want. There's a few I have just like, there's no way. But mostly I kind of want to see how it winds up, or if I get a better impression. And there's a few books that I haven't liked when I started them, but I'm glad I stuck with them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I've had a few that I've quit. There are times when I get to the end, I wish that I'd quit on some more. But yeah, there is that sense of I've got to finish this.
Yeah.
Like I say, there are some that I have not. And I've had cases where if I ever do stop on a book, it's really, really difficult for me to ever go back and try it again.
Yeah.
I have done it.
Yeah.
And sometimes a book like that was The Confessions of Nat Turner. And the reason really I stopped on that one, I was working a summer job when I was in college, and I was working shift work, and I just lost the thread on it but it took me years before I'd ever go back to it again because I stopped it. But I finally did go back and reread it and liked it. But it was, if I ever quit on one, it's hard to go back because I so seldom do.
I was going to quit on the shipping news because I just couldn't get into the way she was presenting it, and then suddenly I did, and I love that book now. But I'm glad I stuck with that one because I was about to bail out.
Is it Annie Proulx?
Annie Proulx, yeah.
I do remember back when I was in college reading Faulkner, and I tried to read every sentence, and understand it. And I was so frustrated, I was just ready to go look up Cliff's Notes, which is what we had back then, until, just as you say, something clicked, and I learned you don't think about it as you're reading it. You just read and then think about it later. It all sort of comes together later.
Well, look at the poor kids whose first college assignment is to read The Sound and the Fury.
Oh, yeah.
And the whole first chapter is in the mind of a crazy person.
Right, yeah,
And,
exactly.
Welcome to college literature classes,
And then you find out who's the best character.
Well-
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
If you stay with it and get through it and get in the right mindset, yeah.
Years ago, I read a review, or an article, I think it was by Jonathan Yardley, who used to review for the Washington Post. And it was on when you're ready for a book. And that was what he said, that he had to read Sound and the Fury in college and hated it. When he went back to it when he was 30, he loved it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he made a case for, with some authors, maybe the things you should be assigning students are some of their easier works, that they're just not, you're going to just scare them away instead of.
I think we've all had that experience. I was forced to read The Scarlet Letter in 11th grade.
Yeah.
Did not get it. And then it was either as an undergraduate or in grad school, read it, and my God, where did this book come from?
Right.
You know?
And maybe that's part of our challenge as teachers, to help students make connections, to find something or make the right choices for them to read, first of all, and then prepare them enough that they can hook into it, and get connected to it
Now,
and
Sam,
enjoy it.
There's something we said about critical thinking skills a little while ago that got me to thinking. The business of reading and writing, which you were talking about. When you read, let's say you don't just read it for the plot. You start thinking about it. You develop analytical skills and thinking about it.
Right.
And organizing that in your mind in ways, and maybe you want to talk to somebody about that book, so you have to present it in some kind of coherent way. And when that happens, you're engaging a critical part of your mind. So reading forces you to acquire critical skills, which you can then put into writing. And what I've always, I remember, it's some academic theory in rhetoric, but that writing is thinking, and thinking is writing. So I even started a company one time called Write Think, and since I was a terrible marketer, I was going to teach people how to write, like corporate types that don't know how to write, and because writing is thinking, and so those are inescapably linked. But reading is behind all that in a way, and so if you read, if you hate it, you learn to understand why you hate the book. That's even something. If you like it, you learn to organize why you like it, and if you write about it, you have to push those skills out into your own exposition and explanation.
Yeah.
which forces critical thinking. I think students that don't read literature, especially, probably aren't acquiring those kinds of critical skills. It's not to say you can't be really smart in something, maybe never read a novel in your life, but I think the people that do, I noticed in your creative writing class, those are smart kids in there, in my opinion. They were analyzing stuff, they were thinking about it, they were expressing coherent explanations about it, and assuming they mastered the craft, they can probably write about it. Why would they want to master the craft? Because they want to express their ideas. So it is kind of all linked to reading, but my concern is we're into it way too late at this point. And how can we put a Band-Aid on it, or a patch or something, or reboot people to maybe they like one of the books you assign, they never expected to like it. That could be the whole start right there, you know. So if we can find those books, and maybe you guys have found ways to do that.
Well, you know, I don't want to get into that, you know, in the good old days, you know, explanation, but there's a lot that can distract young people nowadays, you know. Facebook, video games. I've had to chew out lots of kids who spend too much time playing video games instead of doing their homework. And I'm thinking back in the day, Steve, I mean, after we came in from playing, there was time for a book, or there was time to look at Boy's Life, you know, or remember those books we used to get in the Scholastic books? Was that what it was called?
Yeah.
That was a real treat every Friday when the box would come in.
That's
and
right.
the teacher
I
would
remember
pass out
those.
our books. And a lot of people, that was the first time they read the Diary of Anne Frank.
That's
It was
right.
a Scholastic book.
Well, our time is just about up. We could talk, I think, for another 30 minutes or so, but we've got just a couple of minutes. Tell me what you're reading now. What are you reading, Samantha?
Alice Munro, Dear Life.
I like Alice
yeah,
Munro.
so do I.
Good. You enjoying it?
I love it.
Good.
I'm on the last chapter now. So.
Good. What are you reading, Mike?
Well, I'm writing
Yes.
now. And that's been one of the paradoxes I've discovered. Once you get kind of immersed in your own writing,
You can't read, can you?
it's hard then to find time
Right.
to read. But the last book I finished was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Marquez.
It's a great book.
And that was one of those books that I first read when I was in my 20s and didn't get it, but went back to it now. Really
Much
rewarding.
richer. Yeah. Good. Rod, what are you
I'm
reading?
trying to think of, I just read some nonfiction on Blackwater, which I
Right.
said, but the last fiction I read was The Good Lord Bird, which was awesome.
Really?
Totally recommend that to everybody. It's just a fascinating story and a way of dealing with the whole slavery period, and it's got a real high-level, wicked sense of humor and despair about it. So I didn't think I'd like it, but I highly recommend it. So,
Excellent.
yeah.
And Steve, what are you reading?
I just finished Dorothy Day's The Long Loneliness, and before that I had just reread several Jane Austen novels, of all things. I came across this book by a guy named William Deresiewicz called A Jane Austen Education. It was fascinating and it made me go back and reread these novels that I hadn't read in years. So,
Great. Oh, that sounds interesting. Well, I just finished Karina's Way
Awesome
by
book.
Rod
Yeah.
Davis. It is an awesome book. It really is good, so I encourage you to read that. Thank you again for joining us. Keep reading and keep watching for our roundtables. Thank you.